In November of 1996, a 75-year-old man died in Plant City, where he was born and raised. That morning, he had been loading his lunch into the trunk of an old car he frequently would take for the drive to work. His part-time job was piloting tourists in Orlando in old warbird airplanes like the North American T-6 or an old Waco biplane. And it would make sense that he knew these types of airplanes because he had been flying and doing mechanic work on these and many others since before World War II. In fact, he had received a Special Aviation Mechanics Award only 2 years prior to his death. The Charles Taylor Federal Aviation Mechanics Award, named in honor of the man who had built the Wright brothers' engines and serviced several of the first aircraft to ever fly, required over 50 years of service as a certified aircraft mechanic. The flying of heritage aircraft, which is at times a small world about not only what you know, but who you know, it would make sense in a way for him, because he had served on the Hillsborough County Aviation Authority for 4 years right before receiving his Charles Taylor Award, and it kept him in touch with many airplane enthusiasts of all types. And though partially retired at the time, it would make sense that he would receive the Hillsborough County Aviation Authority appointment due to his many years of civic service. After just completing a term as president of the board at the Florida Strawberry Festival, and 3 years' service as Plant City Commissioner before that, he would now have had time. Truly, his civic involvement spanned across several areas, including the Plant City Chamber of Commerce and their effort to create Hillsborough Community College and the Plant City campus in the 1960s, and the Hillsborough Community College Charitable Foundation Board 20 years later. Plus, he was involved with the Plant City Arts Council, Historical Society, and so much more. But his being only partially retired would make sense, because he still worked, after all, and maintained corporate flying services as pilot for Florida Mining and Materials, Watkins Motor Lines, plus flying the private jets of notable personalities like Jack Nicklaus or Bernie Little with the Budweiser hydroplane racing team effort. His comfort with flying corporate jets would make sense, after all, especially those of the Gulfstream line, because going back 40 years, he had been involved with the promotional flying of the original Grumman Corporation's Gulfstream 1 in the late 1950s. And Grumman Corporation being happy to have him involved would make sense in part because only 2 years prior to that, and in less than 10 years as a commercial pilot, he had already received a National Business Aircraft Association Pilot Safety Award for passing the 1 million mile mark as a senior pilot without any safety incident. And his being available to fly for corporations in New York and in the northeastern United States would make sense because his previous work at Lodwick Airfield and School of Aeronautics in Lakeland, Florida, as mechanic and pilot was winding down after a decade of work there since World War II. He was involved with commercial aviation at what was Lakeland's airport for more than 10 years, but aviation was growing fast and Lodwick was shrinking. As the Detroit Tigers baseball spring training complex was expanding, it was squeezing that airfield down, and aircraft operations were relocating to the World War II training airbase Drainfield on the south side of town. This later became Lakeland Linder Airport and the home of Sun 'n Fun. And his making his younger days career in aviation mechanics and piloting after World War II at Lodwick would make sense, of course, because he had graduated from a United States Army Air Corps technical school as an aircraft mechanic 18 months before the Pearl Harbor bombing and the U.S.'s formal entry into that conflict. And his enlistment into the United States Army in 1939, well ahead of the Pearl Harbor rush, with an interest in the Air Corps to pursue aircraft mechanics, would make sense after all, because his father had served in the First World War in 1918 as a Marine Aviation Detachment mechanic, 3 years before the birth of his son and namesake in 1921. This father had taught both him and his brother to be engine tinkerers and aviation enthusiasts from a young age. And so it would make sense that his 9th grade English 5-page research paper assignment would lead him at age 14 to turn in a 45-page paper that opens with the line, quote, "In the heart of man, there has always been a desire to fly," end quote. And it should be no surprise that his first flight lesson was less than 1 year later at age 15. Yes, this man was quite literally born to fly, at a time when flying was brand new and changing everything. By the time of his death, he had seen the aviation of his youth in a 35 horsepower Taylorcraft going 60 miles an hour, grow instead to break the speed of sound 3 times over, scratch against the rim of outer space, and lead to men on the moon. Yet despite his lifelong love of modern things, on the day of his death, it would make sense that he was loading the trunk of a 31-year-old perfectly maintained 1965 Ford Mustang, because he had bought it as the Ford dealer in Plant City the year it came out, and allowing it to be used to showcase parade celebrities in downtown for decades would make sense. He had been diverted from his love of aviation and operated the Plant City Ford dealership as general manager and vice president for his ailing mother-in-law during the 11 years from 1965 to 1976, and this was because he had married her daughter in 1963. And it would make sense that his dealer demo convertible would be used in the Strawberry Festival Parade because his bride was herself a former festival queen from 1940. And it would make sense that he didn't snap her right up out of high school back then because he was gone to the looming war effort in 1940 when she was crowned. In fact, more than just gone to war or gone overseas, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, he wound up assigned to a new and top-secret Army Air Corps intelligence unit and was stationed for over 2.5 years in Brisbane, Australia, and later moved with that unit to Washington, D.C. at Anacostia Naval Air Station to be nearer to the Pentagon and the Capitol. As far back as 1935, the Japanese had evicted all foreign engineers, labeling them as spies, and they maintained tight secrecy on their aircraft design and developments. This new unit, the Technical Air Intelligence Unit, was created in a big hurry after the Pearl Harbor bombing, and it involved cooperation with the Royal Air Force, the Royal Australian Air Force, and the United States Army Air Corps. The Technical Air Intelligence Unit's job was to gather together any crashed or captured Japanese aircraft and to piece them back together and test fly them in mock combat against their Allied counterparts, to uncover any weaknesses, and to develop air-to-air tactics. So while he was 21 to 24 years old, this technical sergeant worked with the TAIU with particular emphasis on instrument panel reverse engineering. Basically, that meant he had to know how every instrument in an Allied panel worked, and then figure out how the Japanese did it in their aircraft and engines, sometimes working with only pieces at a time. These young men were proud of what they learned, and it would be hard to overstate the importance of this work, because the then current U.S. fighters, early in the Pacific theater warfare, were inferior to those of the enemy, and any weaknesses found could save lives and would impact future fighter design. Eventually, the Technical Air Intelligence Unit reconstructed and flight tested several notable Japanese aircraft, including the HAMP A6M30, the Oscar, the Ki-43 fighter, the Dyna, the Ki-46 twin-engine reconnaissance aircraft, the Tony, a liquid-cooled engine fighter, the Kate, the notorious torpedo bomber that sank our battleships in Pearl Harbor, the Frank, Ki-84 fighter, which was really an improved Oscar and faster than the Allied P-51. After the war, civilian aviation was always moving forward into more and more complicated and capable aircraft, always faster and always higher, and the former Army Air Corps Tech Sergeant moved with the times. He worked to convert his military pilot and mechanic credentials into civilian ones and began a modern aviation career. And during the brief hiatus from flying when he was working as a Ford dealer with and for his ailing mother-in-law, it would make sense how the perfect lure to bring him back to aircraft flying and mechanic work would be to receive a call to help restore and fly an old World War II fighter at the Lakeland Drainfield Airport. Working for and with Wayne Thomas and several plane lovers at the field, he put his World War II skills back to use, restoring this Corsair. And during this time of renewal at that airfield, he was also a founding director of the Sun and Fun nonprofit corporation in 1974. The sponsor of the Corsair restoration project, Wayne Thomas, sadly died less than 1 year after it flew again, and though he did fly it, he did not live to see his airplane receive a Sun and Fun award and trophy for Best Warbird Aircraft in Military Configuration in 1976. After Mr. Thomas's death, the family decided to donate the restored and flying Corsair to the National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, Florida. And Mr. Mooring P. Clark Jr., always known as Bud, the former tech sergeant, the boy who had grown up with aviation in his blood and heart, the Plant City Ford dealer, the future Strawberry Festival president and city commissioner, and so much more, had the honor of flying the old warbird to her last home. When asked if he was nervous about taking the flight up to Pensacola, he answered, quote, "No, I'm not nervous. I'm sad," end quote. For it was that plane which brought him back home to aviation, and he was sad to think it would fly no more. But perhaps he should not have been so sad after all, for she now sits proudly in the main display hangar of the world's largest naval air museum, and that heritage has been seen by people from all 50 states and tourists from all over the world, including many naval aviators and technicians, as part of their graduation ceremonies held in the same hangar. Reflecting on the life of that ninth-grade boy who wanted to fix and fly airplanes, there is little doubt that Mr. Mooring P. Clark, Jr. lived out his true destiny. Here are some of the other noteworthy aircraft he had the pleasure to fly.